Welcome everyone to the Layer 7 Tech Talk Tuesday. I'm Frodo Baggins. I'm here with Gandalf. We're going to talk. Today's topic is 2D special effects. Kidding. Oh, here we go. No, actually, I'd like to welcome everyone. Today we have a fantastic Tech Talk, and we are thrilled to be introducing Mike Amundsen as a new member of our Layer 7 team. He's the principal API architect for Layer 7, and many of you who are joining are probably joining as a result of your relationship with Mike in the past, being familiar with his work. So we welcome you. Mike's role here at Layer 7 is really to be our API design guru. Has been very plugged into all the REST community, what's been happening in development out there on APIs. And really to bring that knowledge and expertise and bring that synergy with what we do in our technology around being a leader in the API management space. So today's topic is a good one. I think it's all about API design, and really I think the thrust of the conversation is around how do you really design your APIs to be as flexible as possible, to be as intuitive and evolvable as possible, to make sure that for those users of the APIs, they have as seamless an experience as possible when they're weaving together APIs to build highly distributed applications, whether that's in a web context or mobile context and so on. Mike, welcome. I think we've actually got quite a few questions already on the social feeds, which is a nice thing for us.
It's cool.
Lots to cover today, but I think it would help if you can kick off and maybe give some initial thoughts around your methodology for how you design APIs.
Sure. Yeah. Well, again, thanks. It's great to be here. I'm really excited about what's coming ahead and being on the Layer 7 team. So hopefully this will set the bar, get some people excited, and we'll have a lot of fun. So actually, one of the things that I've been working on, and this sort of leads right into what the first thing we're talking about, is this notion of some kind of pattern. And so I've been working on the mnemonic of use, usable, scalable, evolvable. And I think these actually are really important goals or principles when you do a design, because they're actually in the order that I think are really important. So creating a usable API is really important. An API that's compelling, that's inviting, that is not complicated, will help you onboard developers, help you actually get people excited about what you're doing. And whether it's an internal project or it's an outward-facing project, whether it's for desktop apps or command line apps or mobile apps, usability is a really big deal. We've learned so much over the last 10 to 15 years about usability from a user interface or user experience perspective. A lot of those same principles can be applied to the actual interface design for programs too. So usability is really important, and we'll be talking a lot about that in the future, and a lot about the specific things that you can do to create a usable experience. And doing that means not only usable now, but usable in the future, usable going forward. You sort of set the standard, set the bar. At some point, we're all going to be competing. Our APIs are going to be competing, and usability is going to be a great way to stand out. So usability is really important, and I actually tell people, think about that first. Let's talk about how we can make it a usable experience, a good experience. Scalability is another big one. Scalability is this sort of weird thing. It's actually not complicated, but hard, right?
Yeah.
So it's some of the simplest ways to make your API scalable. The simplest one is to make it stateless, to actually eliminate session management for servers. It turns out that's a simple thing to do, but most frameworks don't lead us in that direction. It makes it difficult. HTTP was designed to be this stateless pattern. Session management wasn't built in. There is session management in lots of other services, streaming, quality of service values. That's all built in, but HTTP doesn't do that. So, but once you do this, once you drop this, you can end up, it's very easy to start scaling on the public side using caching services, HTTP caching services, caching proxies and that kind of thing. It's also easy within your organization to scale because now you don't have affinity. You can actually use a cluster. You can actually expand out behind the firewall to create a much easier experience. So scalability is really important. It's a good linchpin. The other thing that I talk about, which is sort of the more, I don't know, say controversial one, was evolvability. So the web itself has taught us that you can actually evolve through time. I can use the same client that I was using 5 years ago and visit the site. I can visit the site after it's updated and still use the same client over and over again. So there's this great way of evolving over time. It's very rare for us to build APIs that do this, that allow people to build a client, invest all this time and money in an iOS app or in a desktop application. And then what happens is we need to change something, so we have to convince everybody to rebuild all their apps and redistribute all their app code. So using this notion of evolvability, there are ways that we can mimic what happens on the web today in our APIs. We can give us sort of extended functions. We can give us a chance to add things without breaking things, to allow clients to discover things. So it's another example of one of those that is really complex to when you start, but once you pick it up, you actually have a big win. It's actually easy to move forward. So using those are all sort of major topics, but using those principles to start really gets you going on creating some really powerful APIs for all sorts of platforms.
Yeah, and I think it aligns with, we have all sorts of different communities out there, developers. I think that the usability one is an interesting one. You're right. I think what's different about the world of APIs is that you are competing. You've got a development community. The development community that's actually coding against the APIs in the client world, whether it's mobile app developers or whoever, it's true. They seem to be an impatient group, right? And so the more usable it is, the better. I mean, is it on the scalability one? I think it's interesting that for those of us who have been immersed in web services and other things, and the whole REST-SOAP debates, I think it's almost the gift of the constraints of REST that make it scalable, right? Like it's almost like if you can stay inside this box, then you get the gift of scalability.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, you do. And in fact, if you really look over the design pattern for HTTP, this idea of caching almost had to be created in order to scale. Yeah. Because HTTP is really designed to send really big messages back and forth. It's a lossy network. You're not even sure if the connection got through. You're not sure if you're going to get back to the origin server. So this whole caching model really is what makes it scalable, makes it work. So we don't need guaranteed connections. We don't need point-to-point. We don't need all of that quality of service. But there's also a downside to this whole caching pattern. In reality, caching is kind of like anarchy. Once you put it out there, you can't get it back. If you tell people to cache it for an hour, if suddenly you discover that you did something really bad and misspelled all sorts of words in your blog, you got to wait an hour before anybody's going to know about it. Yeah. So it's a double-edged sword, and it's something that you have to kind of work up and work into. But like you said, if you accept the constraints from the start, you'll have all sorts of possibilities.
Yeah, it's the whole HTTP 1.0 to 1.1 learning.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think the whole idea of that was really behind the REST principles of, hey, the web works, it scales. Why don't we do the same for our interfaces?
Yeah,
that's good. Okay, anyway, I'm sure I could talk all day, but we have a lot of questions to get to. So right off the bat, I know I have a question from Mike on Twitter. Phoenix Thunder, I assume that's the full explosion of the acronym. But anyway, how does one manage RESTful APIs and versioning? Maybe this goes to the evolvable principle.
Yeah, and it's a great question. It comes up a lot. So I usually tell people, don't version. Start from the beginning, do not version. And that sounds pretty scary, actually. But if you think about it, what version of HTML are we using? And does the first version no longer work anymore? Like if I write HTML 1.0, does it not work? Actually, it works, right? So a really smart guy by the name of Jan Algermiesen, who's a German developer architect, came up with this notion that you may change the schema, because that's really what HTML does from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, but you won't change the actual interface. You won't actually, in other words, you can modify schema, but you can still work. So versioning works in component-to-component work. We still need to know versions when we talk behind the firewall and we're on components. But when we cross that wall and we start talking to other machines, versioning actually becomes a burden rather than a help. And some other great examples is if I put a version in the URI, what happens when I change something? Do I change all the URIs for all the clients for all of my API calls?
No.
So you end up with this sort of URI explosion problem. So what I tell people is think of this notion of change. Versioning is just a way to do it. It's not the feature. So think of the notion of change as, can I add something without breaking everything else? And do that first. And we could talk more about it, but eventually also there's this idea of creating bindings against not really your actual high-level domain, like my function name, but against what we call an affordance or a form or a link. So if you write clients to recognize forms and understand what the form is about, then you can add new forms and the client can start doing that. So versioning is not the traditional thing that we think about when we talk about messages.
Yeah, it's like, you don't go to google.com/vu10
Right.
or whatever, right? You just go to Google and then, the same concept in APIs. I mean, are there specific pitfalls in the API design that would, maybe cause problems in there? I mean, other than you talked about don't bind, right?
Yeah. Actually, yeah. So the best strategy is to use the media type, the message design, as what you bind to rather than the domain specific items.
Right.
So if I teach a client, if I teach developers to say, hey, I'm using this media type which has these hypermedia affordances in them, and they'll be decorated with a name like this is add customer, this is use customer, and there'll be one or more parameters that you can recognize. If you teach people to write apps like that, if I add a parameter, especially if I've got a human involved, if I add a parameter, I haven't broken anything.
Yeah.
It gets a little bit different when you do machine to machine, but if you bind to the media type rather than to the domain, you're going to have a lot of freedom and a lot of flexibility. And there's some other rules about forward compatibility and backward compatibility that we can talk about. You can make changes by adding things that don't break anybody else.
Yeah.
And then as long as you don't change the contract, like I guarantee that this field means this, you don't change that contract, you're fine.
Yeah.
So you'll find a lot of large-scale systems, just like in nature, actually. We've got tonsils and appendices. We maybe use those at one time, but if you've ever, in enterprise, there are lots of extra fields, and the new kid always says, why is that there? And somebody says, it's always been there, and there's one client that uses that, we can't take it away. That's the way the internet works, too.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. We can start labeling, deprecated data elements as tonsils.
Tonsils, that's right.
Perfect.
There you go. The tonsil model.
Yeah, and I think, and I think what you're talking about in terms of binding to media types and so on, again, we're getting into how can we leverage, if HTTP is a method of communication, how can we leverage all the stuff that's already there as opposed to, just tunneling through the HTTP. So that's good. Another good REST technique.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
So I think on maybe Twitter, there was another question on Twitter there, which is from Daryl. What are the pros and cons of a reverse proxy versus sending links to the clients with different hosts for service partitioning?
I know Daryl. I think Daryl is just trying to get me in trouble. One of the pros and cons, I'm not exactly sure what he means here, but I think what he may be talking about, and I'm sure Daryl will correct me. So a lot of times what's going to happen is, as you start to grow, you're going to need to maybe start to partition your services to various places. So one of the things you might do is you might start handing out new links. You might actually start handing out new URIs to people. So that's going to partition you over to here or partition you over to here. Another way you might do that is you might continue to handle the same links, and when the message comes back in, using a proxy device to route.
Yeah.
So you may continue to use the same links, but you may make decisions on the inside to route these to various places. So the first example sort of emphasizes the notion that clients shouldn't memorize things, and servers should have the ability to start updating and changing URIs. The downside of that is clients always remember things. They're always going to bookmark something. They're always going to say, some user somewhere is going to say, oh, I remember exactly where my profile is. Don't mess me up. So a lot of times if you change links like that, what you do is you end up writing all sorts of routing rules anyway.
Yep.
So it really depends on the kind of hardware you have, the availability you have. Reverse proxies can be very, very handy because you can even do temporary partitioning or move things to another location. The challenge on a reverse proxy is now you're dependent on that device, right? So you have to make sure that you've got a highly scalable proxy model for that kind of activity.
Yeah, and I think, and maybe this even goes into the abstraction of the API itself, which is, as opposed to thinking of APIs as being tied to the physical servers and domains, it's really, think of your API as a business that you offer out to the world, right? And then however you architect that behind the scenes, again, fits to what you're saying about making it scalable and what makes sense for you.
Yeah, it's the interface, right? We all know from Java developers, .NET developers, we know about interface classes, right? You fill in the interface, you guarantee the interface to other developers. So you should have the freedom to do lots of things behind the scenes. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, we're getting lots of good stuff on Twitter here. I wanna get to Mike's second question. Mike, our second question on Twitter before it falls off the feed here. But get, delete, do not support passing a body, right?
Right.
How does one work through that? I mean, I guess assuming there are cases where you need that.
Yeah. Oh, a great example of a get puzzle, right? So you have a very complex query, like a search pattern, but it's not just Google search. It's not one word. There are several things. You've got a business case where people need to sort of fill in several items. That can get to be a very long query string. It can be very difficult to manage. Or an even more vital one is maybe you've got some very private data, like personal identification data, that you want to use for some kind of search or pass along, but you don't want that stored in a query string because that query string is going to be in lots of servers and so on and so forth. So there are lots of very valid cases for doing these requests, these read-only gets, but using a body. So typically the pattern, the way HTTP is designed, is there's a sort of an out or an EX. We know when we ever did API calls, there's always that EX at the end, which is the extension, and that's what POST really is. POST is really strangely defined. It's non-item potent. It could be used for writes. It could be used for executing your reports, all sorts of things. So very often when I'm doing these complex searches, I'll definitely create a POST body and ship that POST body to the server. The advantage of doing that actually is I could save that complicated search for that user, create a resource on the server, and the next time they want to do that, they can just replay that. So you can actually use that pattern the same way. And very often, that's really what you may have to do in deletes. So you may have some rather complicated rules for deleting an item. So use POST for that. You can definitely use POST for that. Now, if I'm using a common browser and I'm stuck in HTML, I don't have put and delete anyway, so I'm using POST for those kinds of activities. So it's definitely possible to do.
Yeah, I can't remember what the wording is around POST, but there's some ambiguous statement in the HTTP spec that says, for machine data, something integration, something like that.
Yeah.
I can't remember the exact wording, but
it's really the back.
It's a wild card.
Yeah, and that it's used for everything.
Daryl says we need safe POST.
Yes, I think Daryl's actually. I'm not sure if he has actually worked up a spec, but Daryl has talked frequently about safe POST. I want to see an ID from Daryl. Daryl needs to write an RFC.
Perfect. Okay, now from David on Twitter, we've got JSON is in vogue now, but in 5 years, YAML or a new Omega markup language may supplant it. How can you design enduring APIs that aren't going to account for that?
Yeah, that's actually an excellent question, because those of us who have been around the block a few times know exactly what David's talking about. It's XML today. It was XML before. It's JSON today. It could certainly be YAML, or who knows? CSV may become the most important thing that we do. So this is really good. So one of the things that I talk about a lot in API design is the negotiable representations. So I might represent this data on my server as a table. That means I'll send HTML. But I might also want to represent it as a pie chart, which means I'll send a PNG. I might want to represent it for spreadsheets, which means I'll send it CSV. So decoupling the representation with the thing that you're actually sending is really, really important. And the best example, to use David's example, is very often I work with clients who are focused on a desktop application, and the the most comfortable format is XML. So we design a message format in XML. But then somebody says, wait, I need it on a handheld, I need it on my phone, I need it in another format. And the first thing you want to do is you want to switch to JSON. So if you build into your framework, you build into your modeling a representation layer, which you could, if you think about model view controller, this is view management, right? This is templating. If you build that in, you can do exactly what David's talking about. And if they come up with YAML super omega, we can start representing that as the same point.
Yeah, and I know we've certainly gone through that evolution with layer 7, where we were kind of synonymous with XML technology, but now we're as comfortable with JSON. Just again, it's a matter of abstracting the concept of the actual semantics of the data and then how it's rendered and serialized.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, I think we had a question from Ryan on Facebook. So around OAuth, right? So again, I guess, and from a different perspective, we've got the XML to JSON thing. What about OAuth, which is a rapidly evolving standard? What about from the different versions of OAuth, 1.0A to 2.0? What are you seeing out there in terms of handling APIs with OAuth?
Well, one of the things I really emphasize, and I think this is a really good point, I really like where OAuth is going in the sense that it's that possibility of that third-party authentication model. It's really good authentication model. And whether it's just to make sure that I can get up quickly and have people, authenticate through Twitter, authenticate through LinkedIn or Facebook, that's a good OAuth pattern. But I also like the notion that OAuth is separate from your domain specifics. So treating authentication, whether it's through OAuth 1, 2, whether it's through OpenID, or whether it's through sort of standard HTTP auth, treating that as totally outside the domain of your API is really the way to go. So you've decoupled authentication services completely. So just like we were just talking about negotiating for representation of the information, you can actually negotiate for authentication too. So you can let people decide how they want to do that. So if you do that separate from your API design, you've got a lot of freedom. So sure, things may change over time. OAuth 2 is getting a lot more powerful and a lot more flexible. But that doesn't really need to break down any of your API design, because those are separate things. So I think it's real critical, and I really like the notion of the OAuth pattern. I think it's
coming. Yeah, and I think again, it goes to the external view versus the internal view, right? Maybe you are implementing everything in one server, but decoupling it for the outside world gives you a lot of flexibility for the future. You may end up taking that authorization information and turning it into something your internal components understand, right? You may have a specific token that you're storing alone that you can validate against. So yeah, it's that same deal. You're right. It's the difference between sort of what's inside versus what's external. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Another one through Twitter from Sanket. Is there a framework out there that facilitates the development of hypermedia APIs?
Yeah, and the short answer is no. Hypermedia development is really just starting to coalesce, really just starting to make some sense. I will say that I have to say Microsoft's Web API project that they started about a year ago, and that's available, is doing some very, very cool things. They're actually elevating links as almost like a first-class element in the implementation detail. So it makes it much easier to do that. There are some really good examples of that. I happen to like right now, I'm doing a lot in Node. And I like Node because Node is very bare bones. It's very close to the road, and it sort of gets out of the way. But it means I'm actually an HTTP programmer, right? And that's a little bit different than Hypermedia. Right. So I don't see a lot of Hypermedia development tools yet. And in fact, I see a lot of the frameworks that I've worked with in the past and my clients work with sort of lead you away from that. They lead you toward that serializing an object and making sure that the client knows the same object model as the server. And if the server changes the object model, the client's got to change. Right. And that's sort of an anti-pattern for Hypermedia. It's not there yet, and I think we can do some very cool things in the future, but it's going to need some work. Okay, good. Well, I've been saving this one. We got a great question on by email yesterday ahead of the Tech Talk. Excellent. And so this is from Santiago, and without
with all due respect, we were saying, you know, wow, this feels like a bit of an essay question, but it's a great question. So I'm going to read the whole thing verbatim because it deserves it. So Colina and Abrams in their book, Framework Design Guidelines, indicate that one should try to make a framework API very easy to use in basic scenarios. In other words, don't force your API consumers to make many preparations to run a basic scenario in your API. Of course, this is for frameworks, and the book is intended for scenarios when one is designing class libraries that will be used by others to create high-level applications. For example, designing .NET framework. So, you know, however, I think a lot of those concepts make sense when one is designing services-based APIs, web APIs. So how should one design an API that allows users to easily run basic scenarios, and if required, allow more advanced users to run more sophisticated methods? Should I use two separate endpoints? For example, my basic service and my advanced service.
All right.
There it is.
That's an excellent question, and I was talking earlier before we started. I still have the first edition of Christoph and Brad's book. This is a great book on framework design guidelines for the .NET library. Another great book, and I struggle. I could not think of the name. Joshua Block has written a great book for the Java language along the same sort of lines, guidelines for APIs. So both of them focus on the same thing, and as Santi mentioned, it has a lot to do with component design. But some principles there are really correct. That idea of making it easy to start is really important. It sort of goes back to our usability question. So there are lots of things about making an API easy to use. Actually, hard to misuse is another one that Block points out. Like, yeah, it's actually hard to screw this up. Yeah. You know, it's pretty easy. It only takes a couple arguments.
The constraints.
Yeah, right. So you can definitely design your API like that. Another issue, which I think probably comes really close to what Santi's talking about, is we know in human interface this idea of progressive discovery. Like I do something and like, oh, hey, there's a whole bunch more options now that I've sort of changed the state of this message. It's, you know, now that it's read, I can do some other things with it. I can change it or archive it or whatever. And we can do the same things with APIs. Actually, this notion of hypermedia is really based on that idea. Once you change the state of something, now you've got other options that are available to you. So you can definitely use that model. But I think the point that goes right to what Santi is talking about is that easy to start experience. And I don't think you need to have two different ways to start, like sort of like the advanced version and the simple version. But you may need to have multiple interface, multiple calls, multiple opportunities for people. In other words, there may be an easy way to add an item, like you just create a quick body with the name and address and press, and post, and that's it. So you've added it. There may also be a very rich way you can do name and address and alternate address and all. So you actually design the API itself to take various types of messages, and there are optional items, and then you can really teach people, hey, boom, it started, now you can edit, or you can say, hey, if you know exactly what you're doing, there's a rich possibility here. So I think he's onto something really important, and I think the message model rather than the function model makes this really, really possible.
So from an interactive perspective, it could be that you start with the basic one and then present a more advanced one, or you could have just the parameterized in the beginning, but probably not point them to two separate
endpoints. Exactly right, because that could get to be, that starts to add more work to the puzzle.
Yeah.
But you can do what he's talking about. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think that we've got all the questions coming in, but we just touched on hypermedia from one perspective around frameworks, but this is a topic that's so, I see it increasingly talked about, and I think some people have a concept of hypermedia APIs as being, getting just a whole whack load of URLs back in response.
Right.
I think it's worth maybe just talking a little bit about some of your experience. I know you worked heavily with hypermedia APIs recently. What are the, some of the basic lessons around hypermedia APIs, and maybe dispel some of the common misconceptions about them?
Yeah, so let's start with some of the common ones, because I think that probably rings true to most people. So you mentioned one of the first ones, which is this notion that hypermedia is you only have this one possible address, and you have to go to this address first to get all the other addresses, and it's this big mash, and you've got to figure out which one to use. And that's actually not necessarily so. That's not really true. It's not just getting a pile of addresses, and it's not also tunneling people through one place all the time. We don't do that on the web today, right? We bookmark lots and lots of things. So you don't have to start from the same place every time you fire up your machine. You can just start from another place. So that's one of them. I think one of the other ones that's very common is the idea that if you have this notion of a client that follows links, all of a sudden the client has no choice in the matter, like a server-controlled operation, right? So the server says, this is what you do next. The server controls what goes on. And of course, that's not true either. The idea of hypermedia sending links is to give a client a possibility of what to do next, not to force them into something, right? And the other thing that I mentioned quite a bit is a lot of people think that writing hypermedia is very complicated. And it's not really complicated, but it is very different. So the idea of creating a case where you can actually send context information every time somebody asks, for a response. You can say, hey, and these are the things you can do next, like search. And this is how you search. Actually makes writing the messages and even writing clients easier. So along those lines, one of the things that is really I've really been working on the last couple of years and I've learned for some very, very smart folks is I mentioned this earlier, if you create a format that says what's possible next and you create clients that look for those possibilities, whether they're human-driven from a selection list or machine-driven through a set of goals, what happens is the server can start to introduce new order to the events without breaking anything. You might have a possibility where people have to do some uploads and some other things before they finish a task. You might, server for some reason, might change the location where that's done. We're going to upload over here. Well, Hypermedia says that's okay. That's not a big deal. You can upload to another server. You might even change the order of events. You're going to actually fill out data first, then do the upload. And so Hypermedia clients actually end up flexible enough to do this. And here's the perfect case. Think about a company that has to burn EEPROMs into video boxes, right? And that box is going to last for years. So you're going to want to create a situation where servers can make adjustments to things without having to re-burn every single box.
Yeah.
So it's a very viable pattern, and it's very powerful. It just takes a little bit of planning, a little bit of change in tooling is what it amounts to.
And I guess, how important are the Hypermedia APIs and using those techniques to the whole evolvable aspect of APIs?
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, that's good. Because that really is the heart of being able to do some of that. Right? Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So here's a good question from Akihito on Twitter, which is around. Oh, sorry, it's a retweet from Daryl. Okay, good. Sorry, Daryl. It's all good. You're getting retweeted. That's great. Around documenting APIs, I think this goes again back to the whole REST and SOAP divide, and maybe some of the overwrought approaches to documentation and so on. With REST, with RESTful APIs, it's really averse to sort of vendor contributed standards and so on. So what's the best way to document? I mean, you want to get the work done quickly, but at the same time, we want to respect the fact that there's a human developer on the other side.
Right.
And I think we've seen some very good examples of documentation around APIs, but they take a lot of work and a lot of honing of that. But what are your thoughts on documenting?
Yeah, actually, it's a good point. So it is a double-edged sword. So one of the notions of this discoverability, evolvability sort of builds in. That's tough to document. Like, how do I document discoverability? How do I document that it's going to change, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the key approaches is to document the message format first. In other words, what we often do now today is we actually bind our domain problem to the URI. We actually say, here's the URI that you call, and here's the body, the serialized body that goes with this URI, right? We actually create this sort of static patterning. And we bind our business specifics to the URI and a body. I think the better approach is to actually bind to the message format. Like, we support HAL. HAL is a Hypermedia Application Language. It's a registered media type that's both an XML and JSON format. So we use the HAL format. Use a client that understands the HAL format, and then bind your domain specifics to things like this is when this HAL message shows up, this represents a user. When this HAL message shows up, this represents a customer. So it almost doesn't matter what the URI was. When this shows up, this is what it means, and this is what you can do with it. In a lot of ways, this is exactly what we learned from the SOAP world, right? We learned that message design is key to success.
Yeah.
And we can do the same thing in Hypermedia. And what happens is now you don't just say, when this shows up, this is a user. You also say, when you see a form that's marked search, you can do this. When you see a form that's marked edit, you can edit the user. When you see these things, you know what to do. So you start actually documenting what's possible rather than hard coding every URI and every message.
Right.
And that actually works much better in the long run. Now, the bummer is, just like Hypermedia coding tools, we don't have good Hypermedia documentation yet. A lot of people are still using the WSDL, or in the case of sort of lightweight HTTP, the waddle pattern, which is really the RPC function list, right, the URI and the bodies. So we need to develop better strategies for this. I worked on a project about 2 years ago that was called ALPS. It was sort of a profile management kind of deal. And there are some profile management IDs out there to try to document that. But honestly, it's a real challenge. And I've gotten a lot of feedback, which is this is kind of tough. So this is the tough problem that we need to work on.
Yeah. Okay. We got to see. All right. We've got another one from David here. It's good. You see emerging best practices for doing partial resource updates. So post or patch.
Yeah. So this is a great question for a bunch of reasons. The original spec for HTTP was always about replacing content. Like when I send a message, this replaces what's already on the server, or this creates what's new on the server. And put was designed to do that. Put can actually be used to create new material or to replace existing material. It turns out that a lot of times that's not what we need to do. We need to only do a partial change. We need to just modify a few things, especially if you're on a small device. The last thing you want to do is pull down a big long document, make one change, and ship the whole thing back. Yeah. Because you've got a lot of constraints there, bandwidth as well as others. In the very beginning, well, actually in HTTP 1.1, there was a method called patch, which was designed to do just that. Here's a partial representation. Take this diff, and apply it to the item on the server. It didn't go through in original 1.1, and it's taken quite some time, but actually I think it was about a year ago, something like that, patch finally came through. So we have this ability to design diff formats to ship just a small bit back to the server. Well, in the meantime, in the interim of those years, people still had to solve this problem. Yeah. So most people would actually use post, right? So you can send it, and I've designed a lot of these, where you create a little diff message, remove this, add this, change this, delete this in the document, and ship it across. Now, what I do see some people do is sort of dividing their resource into lots of sub-resources. So you might actually invent a little pattern that says, for customer 123, comma, field name equals this, new value equals this, and sort of kind of create a message that sort of creates sub-resources. In the long run, that gets really difficult to cache, it gets really difficult to manage, and Lord help you if you've got 20 people who are editing the same record. Yeah. So this idea of using post or patch, I think, is smart. I'm starting to see some good examples of it. There's a patch for XML, and I think there's a JSON schema pattern or a JSON patch that's also being worked up right now. I think if we can get those two in line, the XML one's actually very good. We can get those two in line, I think it'll be a lot easier to deal with in the future. Yeah, and again, it just goes right back to the whole caching and idempotence and everything. That's it's probably an optimization exercise to see, what's your bigger constraint, bandwidth or risk of overwriting or repeating events that can cause a bad state. Yeah. Okay, so Mike, I got another one. For RESTful APIs, so you mentioned waddle as being, at least a method of describing RESTful APIs, and layer 7, that's what we're using right now in our portal to
to kind of do the console and explorer of APIs. Are there tools to generate waddles for APIs if you had access to the API?
There might be. I don't use them simply because I'm not really a fan of creating that sort of static pattern. I know, for example, in the we talked about the portal for just a second. The cool thing about the way you guys use Waddle is that actually makes the API sort of testable, right? It's a kind of a cool sandbox. I really like that idea. There's a similar spec Mark Nottingham, who works at Rackspace, has put up, which I think he's calling Home, which is very similar. It goes a little bit further than it's similar to Waddle. It goes a little bit further, describes some more of the arguments and some more of the possibilities. I don't know if they're generators, and I'm not sure if I would encourage it, to be honest with you. I think if you start to work in the message format style rather than in the function style, then I think we're going to start to discover there are other ways that we should kind of focus on generating.
Yeah, and I guess aspirationally at least, right, using the hypermedia approach, the guided kind of hypermedia approach would be another way of being much more discoverable and not necessarily.
It is, but it goes back to the question we had earlier. We don't have a good way to document hypermedia right now, and we've got to improve that as well. So people will continue to use things that make sense and work, like Waddle, until we can come up with a smart way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
A pragmatic approach.
Exactly.
Okay. Pedro has a question around hypermedia APIs. Do they require machine readable description of the used media types and relations?
Yeah, so my simple answer is no. Like, we have HTML, right? HTML is not documented in a machine readable format, right? And HTML is a hypermedia type. We have Atom. Atom's a hypermedia type. Doesn't use this documentation model. However, I think there's a lot of value in attempting that. So that was part of my approach in that profile semantics called ALPS, was to try to see if we can build up something like this. Tantik Celik, who's a really, really influential guy in the microformat space, has come up. He really came up with this notion of a profile and a kind of a machine readable format for profiles. It hasn't become very popular, but I think it's leading us into the kind of thing that Pedro may be talking about, and there may be some real value there. If I want to really accept the notion that link relations, like link identifiers, start to really tell me what the API is doing. So if you buy in the notion that you've got affordances, links, and forms, you still need domain-specific information like those identifiers. Then what Pedro's talking about could be extremely valuable for machine-to-machine activity. Wouldn't it be cool if I could take a format and lay that profile, that semantic information on top of it in some form, and as sort of a plugin for a client, and now this client understands this business profile. So I don't know that there's one yet. Tantik Celik's talked about it. Eric Wild has also put up an ID for the profile link relation. So we may be getting close to something like that. I would love to hear about any ideas people have on that topic.
Good. We had a note on Twitter from Daryl, who's been very vocal. Thank you, Daryl. But CXF JAX-RS supports auto generation of Waddle for JAX-RS endpoints. So
there you go.
That's good.
There you go. That's very good.
But he just qualified and said not that he would recommend using it for the same reasons that you mentioned.
Yeah, that's funny. That's good.
So maybe I guess a topic, we talked about versioning and evolvability and so on, and there's an aspect of that to reusability. But maybe it'd be good to cover, the ultimate goal, I think now, as we talked about at the outset of APIs, is there's competition. You're really trying to appeal to a very broad community of developers. What are some of the other techniques around making your API reusable?
Yeah. So that's actually very good. So there's a couple of things to think about. If I'm creating an API for some space, I have to figure out, am I trying to solve an entire problem here, or am I trying to solve just sort of the basic problem, like computing scores or some limited sort of domain issue? If I can set up my API so that it's general enough that other people can use it, I'm way ahead of the game, right? Because now Other people start writing clients for that particular service or that particular functionality, and they start using that functionality in new ways. So a great example of this sort of reusability concept is from Donald Norman, who does the work with Nielsen Norman Group, and wrote the book The Design of Everyday Things. And he's the one who talks a lot about user experience. So he gives this great talk about the way you design an object. And one of his comments, which I love, is really well-designed objects, whether they're doors or like devices or anything, is it offers such a rich set of affordances of things you can do with it that users will find new ways to use this device, ways that the original designer hadn't intended. And I think that's a key for API usability. It's so cool when, this has happened a couple of times, when I discover people are using a design pattern that I never thought, oh, that's amazing that you can actually use that for that. So making sure they're reusable a lot of times is keeping them general enough to solve the problem well, sort of like to go back to Santi's original questions, but not so specific that they can only be used for one particular thing. So that's a sort of a fine line, and that's a real design issue rather than a technical issue. I think that can make a real difference.
Okay, good. How are we doing for good for time? This has been great. As I said, we could keep going and going. I think we'll do a last call for questions on the social media sources. Maybe while we do the last call, I'll just throw it out there. Any particular APIs that you've worked on or used, or that that you'd see as model citizens that you might throw out there, or
it's really hard to say. Actually, so much of my work recently has been on message design. I actually really say there are a couple of message patterns that I really like for solving lots of different problems. I mentioned one of them already. This hypermedia application language, HAL, designed by Mike Kelly, and he's got both an XML and a JSON version of this. And this is a very straightforward, very compact style for expressing all sorts of things. And it's actually starting to get some very cool uptake. And if you just Google Hypermedia Application Language or HAL and Mike Kelly, you'll find some documentation and some pointers to some very cool things.
We got Mike retweeting on Twitter. I don't know if it's
yeah, that's exactly Mike. That's exactly Mike.
Hey Mike.
Yeah, he's got a really cool design that really can be applied in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
I also worked on a design called Collection JSON, which is a similar pattern. It's a little bit more verbose than Mike's. Atom is still a very, very powerful way to express hypermedia. It's got some limitations, but it's very widely distributed. So I think those are really, really cool designs that you can use to solve lots of problems. So mentioning that, there are a handful of approaches to APIs. Google, I'm not sure if Google is still doing this with Google+, but they had a very cool set of hypermedia designs that they were working on, where the message actually had these affordances, these ways to click back in. And it was around Google+ data, and I don't know if somebody will be able to remind me of exactly which one it is. That's one of the first things that come to mind. There's a company called there's a company called Cloud App, which is actually working on a new design that's similar to this. Our status is using this application semantic pattern in HTML. They're actually turning their HTML responses. Our status is like a Twitter example code. They're actually turning their HTML responses into their API by marking it up in ways that machines can read it. And there are a handful of these in several cases, and they're all around this notion of starting to inform the client, not just some static list of things to do, but what's possible right now, sort of context information, which is very, very cool. I really like that. Yeah, so Akihito has actually put the link in Twitter for HAL, so that's very cool.
Awesome.
Yeah, very good.
Okay, well, Mike, it's been a huge pleasure. Thanks to everyone who participated greatly on the social media feeds.
Absolutely.
Again, it's fantastic to have you on the Layer 17,
Yep.
and we look forward to the next Tech Talk, and I'm sure you'll be back for one of these again.
Love it.
But we look forward to, if you have any follow-up questions that we didn't cover or you want to expand on topics, just send it through the feeds.
Yep.
And until then, we'll see you next time.
That's it.
Thanks.